In our last session, we talked about that historical, the literary context of the Star of Bethlehem. We talked about the stories of the Messiah, or of the stars being born, or stars being present at the birth of really significant individuals and things like that. Now we're going to shift gears, and we're going to begin to try to identify what the Star of Messiah was. But where do we begin with that? There's a lot of stars in the sky. How do we narrow it down to just one? Well, one starting place would be to look in the gospel text of Matthew for some astronomical language that might be present that perhaps could help us identify the astronomical event. And indeed, we'll actually find that Matthew's text contains some vague but distinctly astronomical language. Now, there are a few clues like this in the narrative. Now, the fact that the language, astronomical language, does appear in Matthew's text indicates that Matthew knew that this was an astronomical event, not just kind of some spiritual thing. But the fact that it's vague suggests that Matthew probably did not know exactly what it was. Because if he knew what the event was, he probably just would have said what it was. It also implies that Matthew was not an expert in astronomy or astrology, and I wouldn't have expected him to be. He didn't expect his readers to be experts in astrology or astronomy. So we're left with only a few vague clues in Matthew's text. Our first clue is the term star. So the Greek term for star is astir. And that the term star, or astir, may be misleading because it may cause us to think of just a single point of light in the sky. But in astrological terms, star was used to refer to a single star or a planet or a grouping of stars or planets. The Sumerian term known by Babylonian astrologers was a kakabu. Even a constellation can be referred to by this term. So it's actually a very general, very vague term. But what that tells us is that instead of looking for one celestial object, a literal star in the sky, or one very bright star, we should broaden our search. Another astronomical term that's used in the narrative is in the east. Now, the phrase east, or the word east, appears a couple of times in the narrative. First, it says that Magi from the east came, right? But then it says that the Magi from the east said, we saw his star in the east. And the Greek term there for in the east is enti Anatoli. All right, this term is different from the previous term from the east. It's actually plural. So if we were to translate it hyperliterally, we would say, we saw his star in the easts, plural. Whereas the Magi from the east is singular. Another way that you can interpret this term, the Greek term, is we saw his star at its rising. But some translations actually render it this way. You'll find it that they say, we saw the star at its rising. But the question is, every star rises. The earth is constantly spinning and the stars are coming up from the eastern sky. So it doesn't seem to indicate anything significant to say that the star rose. It doesn't give us any more information. However, this term is actually very similar to a specific astrological term found in other Greek literature from Greek astrologers. They will use a similar term to refer to an object's heliacal rise. Now let me explain the concept of the heliacal rise. So if you were to follow and map the course of the sun over the sky over the year, it would appear to make a path across the field of background stars over the course of the year. At certain times of the year, some stars are visible, and at other times of the year, they become invisible because they're too near the star, angular-wise, and they get washed out by the sun's light, sun's light. So it goes through this cycle, and at the moment that there becomes enough distance, angular distance between the sun and then the star, that when the star first appears, that's called its heliacal rise. So the heliacal rise of a star is considered a really important, significant moment, a significant event from an astrological perspective. Throughout the centuries, it's been that way. So the heliacal rise is what's indicated by this term Endi Anatoli. So the Magi were saying, we have seen his star in its heliacal rise. Now here are some more astronomical terms that we'll find in the book of Matthew. Herod inquired from the Magi what time the star had appeared. Now wait a second, it's a star. Stars don't appear, they're stars. They're always in the sky, right? But literally the text says the time of the appearance of the star, the Greek root pheno is the same root, or it's appearing, the same root that we get the term phenomenon. This term appearance is also a term for the heliacal rising of the star. So it appears because it's far enough away from the sun's light doesn't wash it out. So there's enough angular distance between the sun and the star, so it can be seen either at sunrise or sunset. Another possibly astrological or astronomical term found in Matthew is when the Magi arrive in Bethlehem and they saw this event, whatever it was, occurring again, and it says that it came to rest over the place, and came to rest over the place. The Greek term there for resting is proigen. Some scholars will say that this term proigen refers to retrograde motion. So retrograde motion occurs when a planet is progressing through that background field of stars. So the stars all kind of stay relatively stable to each other, and then the planet is progressing through the stars, and then it appears like the planet begins to slow down, stop, or even move backward, and then it will then continue ahead in its original path. That appearing to go backward and then going forward again is called retrograde motion. Of course, the planets are just continuing to go through a stable orbit around the sun. It's just the way that the concentric orbits of the Earth and the planets work that looks like they're going back in the angle as we pass by. So, at least according to some scholarly opinions, this term proigen refers to the retrograde motion of a planet, the resting of the star at Bethlehem. Now, this part of the presentation might make you feel uncomfortable. In fact, very few presenters on the Star of Bethlehem go here. To be honest, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable too. We want to learn the language of the Magi. So we need to learn a little bit about what Persian and Babylonian astrology taught. So most Star of Bethlehem presentations take a different route. They'll begin with a list of astronomical events and then try to eliminate them one by one. And to find out the one that works. So could it be a comet? Well, it could be a comet for this, or it couldn't be a comet because of this. Could it be a supernova? Could it be a conjunction? And et cetera. Just kind of go through that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start with the question of what did ancient astrology teach? And then with this information, we'll know what to look for. And from that point, we can move forward and see if there's a qualifying astronomical event. Now, you have to be aware that astrology is a complex and intricate system of thought. And this is a big stumbling block for many Star of Bethlehem enthusiasts, especially those who are very well versed in astronomy, but not astrology. They'll oversimplify. They'll say, well, Jupiter stands for this, and this constellation Aries stands for this, and the moon means this, and then this planet stands for kingship, so this constellation is for the Jews, and they think they have it all figured out. Because they think they can just make the connections like that. They think they can make it up like that. But they don't realize that astrology is an extremely complicated discipline that had been developing over thousands of years. And it's filled with all kinds of laws and principles. And Star of Bethlehem enthusiasts often have a very superficial understanding of astrology that either leads them astray or leads them more likely to confirm whatever conclusion that they already favor. So now we have to remember, Babylon at this time is under the Parthian and Persian Empire. So there will be some crossover between the Babylonian or Assyrian astrology and Persian astrology. So we'll need to kind of look at it from both angles to understand the view of the Magi. One difficulty we have, is a big difficulty, we have very little information about how ancient Persians and Babylonians interpreted the stars. We do have records of their observations and predictions in terms of where and when different astronomical events would take place, but we have little explaining what those interpretations or what those events would mean. So to fill in the missing details, how do we do that? Well, one approach that we could take would be to look at Persian astrology from a little bit later era, when we do have information about their interpretations. So this is going to be a little anachronistic for us to do that, because there is a span of time that separates between those later astrologers and the Magi. But there were good reasons to believe that these traditions and beliefs would go back to an earlier era. Ancient Persian astrology influenced later astrologers. Because in a field like astrology, there's a patriotic cultural association. There's a desire to seek the ancient paths of the ancestors. So in the Middle Ages, there was a renaissance of ancient Persian astrology that gives us at least a little window into what may have been an earlier Persian tradition. There are two significant scholars of Persian astrology in the Middle Ages. There's Abu Mashar and Masha'allah, who both documented Persian astrology. Masha'allah was actually a Persian Jew and he was an expert in Persian astrology, who oddly enough had his own astrological formula for determining the birth of Jesus. A very fundamental component of Persian astrology is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. Some people refer to a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction as a great conjunction, but that term is kind of ambiguous, so that's probably not the term to use. A better term is a superior conjunction, because this is a conjunction of superior planets, outer planets. And that's what makes it unique. That's what makes it significant. Mercury and Venus, they're very near. They're very near the sun. They're within the Earth's orbit, so they're always going to appear near the sun. And conjunctions with them are going to happen all the time. But since Jupiter and Saturn are not only very bright points, but they appear to travel very slowly across the entire range of the sky, when they come in contact with each other, then it's a more important moment, it's a more significant time, and it actually indicates a new era. And that happens about once every 20 years. Not extremely uncommon, but Jupiter and Saturn will come into contact, or line up, I should say, every 20 years. So what is a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction exactly? The stars in the sky, as I said, retain their same position relative to one another. And you don't see the North Star moving around. It stays in its spot in relation to the other stars. But the planets do move in that field of stars, and they generally move in the same direction at different speeds. So Jupiter will be moving across the sky at a slow pace, and then Saturn will come by at a slightly faster pace. And over the course of the year, Saturn will then overtake Jupiter, catch up with Jupiter, overtake it, and continue on its way. So that moment when Saturn comes and overtakes Jupiter is called the conjunction. All right. So during a conjunction, the two planets are near one another in the sky. But here's where people who look at this purely from an astronomical perspective rather than an astrological perspective are led astray. A conjunction is not necessarily an occultation. Now, don't worry about this term occultation. It doesn't mean anything, it has nothing to do with the occult, okay? We're talking astronomy here. And occultation is when one celestial body, like a planet, comes in front of another astronomical body so that you can't see the one behind. They actually appear to intersect in our field of view. And it's a very rare extremely rare event for Saturn and Jupiter to experience an occultation where Jupiter is in front of Saturn in our view. That'll happen again in about 5,000 years. But generally speaking, they're just not in that same path through the sky. They're going to be near each other, but they won't very commonly touch. So in a typical scenario, when Saturn catches up with Jupiter in the sky, astronomers are unimpressed. They think this is completely insignificant because at their closest approach, there's a space of maybe a degree of an angle in between them. So the 2 points of light, they don't look like one big glowing orb. They just look like 2 points of light. So to astronomers, it seems like an insignificant event. But to Persian astrologers, once those 2 planets align, regardless of how much space is in between them, it's like the hour hand of the cosmic clock just reached 12. And so a new epoch has dawned, a new era has occurred. Now this 20-year cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions is absolutely foundational in Persian astrology. The meeting of Saturn and Jupiter marks the basic unit of time in the universe. This time interval determined the rise and fall of dynasties, of prophets, and of religions. So far it's been a little bit weird here. Now, it's about to get weirder, all right? So brace yourselves. Here are the 12 zodiacal signs. The signs of the zodiac represent the constellations in the heavens that the sun and the moon and the planets pass throughout the year, since they always remain in this sort of a narrow belt across the sky. So the 12 signs represent 12 constellation landmarks that are used to describe a celestial object's position in the sky. So it's not like the ancients looked up in the sky and they were just doing dot to dots and thought, oh, that kind of looks like a fish. And no, it's really, they needed some way to describe where something was. And so making those pictures actually helped serve as landmarks to easily remember and recognize sections of the sky. By this time in history, the entire region had accepted the same standard set of landmarks, the same set of constellations and their names. So these are actually Greco-Roman names, the ones that even you'll find in your horoscope page of the newspaper today. But the Persians at this time had already adopted this same pattern. It's a universal standard. So they go in this order. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, just like that. But you can see that the Persians categorized them into four groups. These 4 groups correspond to the 4 elements, fire, earth, air, and water. So Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius refer to the fire signs. Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, they're referred to as the earth signs. Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius are called the air signs, and then Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces are the water signs. So that's how they're categorized according to Persian astrology. Now here's the path that objects take through these constellations as they move through the sky. Right? So each one of these symbols is just shorthand. It's just a short notation for those astrological constellations that I mentioned to you. These are just little icons to help us remember those, symbols to help us remember those. So at the top is Aries, and it goes around in this clockwise direction. And you can see it goes through, alternates between the different elements. So it starts with a fire and goes through fire, earth, air, water, fire, earth, air, water, fire, earth, air, water, like that until it finally reaches back at fire again with Aries. So and so that's the path that the sun will make, that the planets will make. They'll move through each of these as they go around in the year. Now, an interesting pattern occurs with the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. Jupiter and Saturn are moving through all of them like that. But when the conjunctions occur, they occur in a really interesting way. You see, first there will be a conjunction that will occur here in Aries. And then the next one, 20 years later, will be in what is this one over here? Leo, right? And then the next one will be in the third fire sign here of Sagittarius, right? So the conjunctions will stay in this triangle of fire signs for a number of years. In fact, it'll stay like this for about 200 years in the fire signs. So then, after about 200 years, they will proceed to the air signs, and these conjunctions will occur here in the air signs in this triangle for another 200 years. And then after that period is completed, it will begin to progress through the air signs. So at fire, earth, air, now it's going through the air signs for 200 years, and then finally it'll go through the water signs, and it'll stay there for 200 years until it returns then to the fire signs. And fire is where it's considered to begin there with the constellation of Aries. Now, because there are these cycles, there are different ways to describe a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So one way you could describe, one type of conjunction would be a small conjunction. So a small conjunction is a type of conjunction that occurs in the same element as the previous one. So as long as those conjunctions remain in the same triangle, in the same color, that's going to be called a small conjunction, and that happens every 20 years. A middle conjunction is one that has a little bit more significance, and it happens when it begins to move from one element, one triangle in our diagram, to the next. And that happens, as I said, about every 200 years. Now, this is not a clear-cut transition. So sometimes there's this intermediate period where it will vacillate between one element to another before then shifting finally solidly into the next element. And then finally there's what's called the Great Conjunction, which designates the completion of the element cycle. In other words, the cycle has moved from the fire signs to the earth signs, to the air signs, and finally to the water signs, and then returns to the fire signs again, and that completes the cycle. And that happens approximately every 800 years. Now, those 800-year periods are considered the great epoch of Persian astrology. All right, so let's take a look at some of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions that occurred in the century when Yeshua was born. Here we can see there's a conjunction that occurred in the sign of Cancer that happened. It's a water element, so it's coded in blue as a water element. It happened in 86 BC. Then there was a conjunction in the sign of Pisces. Right? It's another water element, and it happened in 66 BC. And then it happened in Scorpio in 46 BC. All right, so, and these were all signs of the water element. Water is the final element of the cycle, right? So then in 26 BC, it shifted into the fire signs, and now it's in Leo. But before it was able to complete that fire element cycle, or before it was able to complete that cycle move into the fire elements. In 7 BC, there was one final conjunction that occurred in the sign of Pisces, which you remember that's the very last element, last sign in the zodiac, and it happened again in the water element. All right, so here we are at the very culmination. This is actually the culmination of that 800-year cycle, isn't it? The end of that epoch, that 800-year epoch. Then it continues then in the fire signs in Sagittarius and Leo in succeeding generations. Now, to look at the context, when have these Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions happened before? I mean, what are they associated with historical events? Well, there is an interesting fact that in 165 BC, there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Now, again, this happens every 20 years, so it's not a really amazing coincidence. But it happened in the year of the Maccabean Revolt. All right? So if you've ever heard of the story of Hanukkah, when the Maccabees revolted against the Seleucids, the Syrian Greeks, this was a year of a conjunction. And that was the year of a new dynasty in Israel. It was the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. Of course, they relit the menorah in the temple. The story is that they had enough oil to light the menorah and have it be lit for one day, but it lasted for 8 days. And so when we celebrate Hanukkah commemorating this event, we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days. But that's not the only reason that we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days. The other reason that we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days, it's a little less known reason, is that it is the belated celebration of the holiday of Sukkot. So the Jewish people were unable to come into the temple to celebrate Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. You might know it as the Feast of Tabernacles, because the temple was defiled by the King Antiochus, right? So when Hanukkah came around, when they cleansed the temple and they were able to re-enter it, they decided we're going to celebrate that holiday of Sukkot that we had to put off a couple of months prior. Now Sukkot is an 8-day festival, and so it makes sense to celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days also in relation to that. Now I'd like to actually show you this conjunction. We're going to go to the year 165 BC, which astronomers refer to as the year negative 164, because they are bothered by the fact that we skip the year 0. It messes with their math. So negative 164 is the year 165 BC. We're going to go to September 1st, and about 7 o'clock p.m. And I'll look in the southwestern sky. There we go. So I know this is some fine detail here, but we've got Saturn right there, Jupiter and Mars, kind of all massed together right there. This is what the sky looked like, and this is from the vantage point of Jerusalem. So I'm gonna highlight Saturn. So Saturn is the one with that pulsating red lines around it. Can you see that? Okay. So that's you can see they're very close to each other at this point. I'll put on this grid here so we can kind of see how they are in relation to each other. And so west is right here. They're moving in a generally westward direction. So Saturn then is behind Jupiter. And we'll watch what happens now. I'll move forward in time. And as I do so, watch how Saturn begins to come and catch up with Jupiter. The September 6th, September 7th, September 8th, September 9th, September 10th, September 11th, September 12th. Here's the interesting thing. When we get to September 12th, if you were to look at that on the Hebrew calendar, you'd find that this happens to be the holiday of Sukkot. Right? This is the first day of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And remember, it's an 8-day holiday. So here's the 2nd day, 3rd day, 4th day, 5th day, 6th day, 7th day, and 8th day of Sukkot. And you can see Saturn catching up with Jupiter as we go through. So this day, the 8th day is actually referred to as Shmini Atzeret, Jupiter and Saturn have lined up, and then Saturn then continues on its way going forward. Isn't that, I just find that amazing. I find that coincidence very interesting. At this time when the Maccabees begin to rule over Israel, the first independent Jewish kingdom since Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Solomon's temple hundreds of years prior. One of the most pivotal moments in Jewish history. Let's take a look. There's another important historical conjunction. This one occurred in 134 AD at the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with this historical event, there was a Jewish military leader at this time. His name was Shimon Bar Kosiva. Now, he led an almost successful revolt against the Romans, who were very severely oppressing the Jewish people at this time. And one of the leading rabbis declared that Shimon Bar Kosiva was the Messiah. And he said, this man is going to liberate our people from the Romans. Now, this turned out not to be the case, as we know from history. But in declaring him to be the Messiah, this rabbi made a play on words and renamed Shimon Bar Kosiva as Shimon Bar Kokhba. And Bar Kokhba means son of a star in Aramaic. Now, why did he name him Bar Kokhba, it may have been that he was inspired by the fact that there was a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that very year, and that may have led that rabbi to believe that this must be a period of redemption and at the time of a new Israelite dynasty, a new Jewish kingdom. Could be. Now let's take a look at the conjunction that occurred in 7 BC, which is the only one really of that list that falls within anywhere in the range that we would expect for the birth of Yeshua. Actually, you might be thinking, 7 BC, that's a long time. How could Christ be born that long before Christ? It just doesn't seem to compute, right? But don't forget that King Herod died in 4 BC. Now, Herod was alive and kicking when Jesus was born, and he was especially when the star was appeared. So there is an alternate theory that proposes that Herod died in 1 BC. But this is generally considered a fringe hypothesis. It's rejected by most scholars. And it's favored by some Star of Bethlehem scholars. And I think it's because they're looking for a date closer to 1 AD. For the birth of Messiah. But the broad consensus of scholars who are not trying to say anything about the Star of Bethlehem, who just want to know ancient Jewish and Roman history, will accept that Herod died in 4 BC. So looking for 7 BC for a date is actually really perfectly within our range. Now, there's something about this conjunction that occurred in 7 BC that sets it apart from the other ones, though. The conjunction that occurred in 7 BC was actually what's called a triple conjunction. Now, some people don't understand the term triple conjunction. They think that it means that there must be 3 things that join together in the sky. That's not what it means. A triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn happens like this. Jupiter's passing through the sky, minding its own business over the course of the year, and then Saturn comes and catches up with Jupiter, just as it normally does. But just at that moment, after Saturn catches up with Jupiter, it goes into retrograde motion. Remember that? So it begins to slow and go backwards. And so Jupiter is able to catch up with Saturn and overtake it. Well, then Saturn then kicks into high gear and moves back into its normal motion and catches up with Jupiter once more. So you can see Saturn comes, overtakes Jupiter, slows down, Jupiter comes and overtakes Saturn, and then Saturn speeds back up and overtakes Jupiter once more. That's a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. Saturn overtakes Jupiter, Jupiter overtakes Saturn, and then finally Saturn overtakes Jupiter. So this is a very rare event because in order for this to happen, 2 infrequent events have to happen with perfect timing. Saturn's brief period of retrograde motion has to happen immediately after Saturn happens to pass Jupiter, or else it won't mesh, it won't align. So it's a very rare, a very significant event. Here are the times when this has happened in history before and after the birth of Yeshua. It happened once in 820 BC, which is that's around the time of maybe Elijah the prophet. It happened once in 146 to 145 BC. It happened in 7 BC, that's the one that we're looking at, and then the next one happened in 333 AD. Now, it also nearly happened in 126 BC. And it's worth mentioning because what happened was Saturn passed Jupiter, went into retrograde motion after the fact, right? Jupiter went to go and almost overtook it, but didn't quite before Saturn kicked back into gear again. So it's worth noting, at least, that there was a very nearly triple conjunction in 126 BC. So we can see that it's not only a rare occurrence, but it doesn't happen on a regular interval. You can't say, this happens every 500 years. It can be predicted, but the math is a lot more difficult. It isn't predicted by intervals like that. So, but if this was the thing that happened, what about these other ones? What happened in 146 to 145? Where did the Magi go to King Herod? Well, not King Herod, but did he go to Jerusalem at that time? I mean, what may have happened at those times? Now, remember how I mentioned the Maccabees. Remember how they defeated the Seleucids and set up an independent Jewish kingdom. Well, they founded a royal family. Anybody know the name of the royal family of the Maccabees? It's the Hasmoneans, right? The Hasmoneans. They set up a family called the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, they didn't rule as kings right away. I mean, they had just thrown off the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucids. And so after that initial victory, it took some time for the Jewish people to gain security and autonomy. And so for the first couple of generations, their leaders were not kings. They were military commanders. And so this started with Simon the Maccabee. He was one of Mattathias' original 5 sons. He was the first military leader. And when he was assassinated, his leadership was passed on to a man by the name of John Hyrcanus. And John Hyrcanus did a lot to stabilize the nation, but he still served as a military leader. Now, when John Hyrcanus died, leadership was given to his oldest son, whose name was Judah Aristobulus I. It was this Aristobulus here who was the first to assume the title king and to claim a kingdom. Josephus records this. He says, when their father Hyrcanus was dead, the oldest son, Aristobulus, intending to change the government into a kingdom, for so he resolved to do, first of all, put a diadem on his head 481 years and 3 months after the people had been delivered from the Babylonish slavery and were returned to their own country again. You can see how Josephus sees that as a pivotal moment. He's counting the number of months since Babylon that this event happened, and Aristobulus is putting a crown on his head as king. Now, when was Aristobulus born? We don't know, but it appears that he must have been born very near the year 145 BC, which was the year of one of those triple conjunctions. If he wasn't born on 145 BC, it was within a couple of years. But as a king, he only lasted a short time. His kingship was passed on to his half-brother, Alexander Yanai. Now, according to a Jewish historian named Rabbi Beryl Wein, Alexander Yanai was the greatest of the Hasmonean kings in terms of his wealth and his conquest and his power. He greatly expanded the territory of the kingdom of Israel into what is now Syria and Jordan. Not only did Alexander Yanai rule as king, but he also served as high priest. Since the Maccabees were of priestly lineage, they were from the family of the descendants of Aaron, right? So now the rabbis condemned him for taking on both leadership roles. If you're going to be the king, give up the position of high priest. If you're going to be the position of high priest, let someone else have the position of king, especially somebody from the Davidic family. That would make more sense. But he didn't. And that caused a lot of conflict between Alexander Yanai and the rabbis. And to spite the rabbis and to take control away from them, he decided to adopt the position of their opponents, the Sadducees, to give the Sadducees more power. Now, Alexander Yanai, we actually do know what year he was born. He was born in the year 126. That was the year of that near triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And so it might be for this very reason that the coins that he minted bear the image of a star, an 8-pointed star with a diadem around it. Maybe that somehow influenced his own sense of identity. So as 7 BC rolls around, the Persian stargazers know very well that Jupiter and Saturn are primed to perform the same dance that they did those other times. The last 2 times that this happened, the King of the Jews was born. So perhaps they felt confident that such an event was destined to occur again. It's possible. It seems like a likely situation. Now, this idea of Jupiter and Saturn is not a new idea. This is a very common theory. It's the most common theory regarding the Star of Bethlehem. It's so common that it has a name. It's called Planetary Conjunction Hypothesis. It's got an acronym. It's PCH. Right. So what I'm telling you is not anything that's that innovative, other than that I'm bringing it to you from a very different direction from usual. This theory was actually first proposed hundreds of years ago by Johannes Kepler. Now, or a similar theory anyway. He had the advantage over modern astronomers in that he was also an astrologer. In fact, you might recognize this diagram from one of the previous slides. This diagram was drawn by Johannes Kepler. Now, some people say that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction can't possibly be the Star of Bethlehem. That this planetary conjunction hypothesis can't be true because Jupiter and Saturn, they didn't line up, they lined up, but they didn't merge together. They stayed too far apart. Like they didn't look like a big, giant, glowing orb like the Christmas cards show, right? But that's not how the astrology works. That you can't dismiss the PCH, the planetary conjunction hypothesis, because the planets didn't come as close as an astronomer would find exciting. Now, let's take a look at this from a Babylonian perspective. Archaeologists in Babylon have uncovered clay tablets that are astronomical almanacs. You've heard of the Farmer's Almanac? Farmer's Almanac is a set of predictions of what the weather is going to be like and things for the coming year, right? The Babylonian astrologers also had almanacs that made predictions about the positions of the sun and the moon and the planets for the upcoming year. These predictions were made based on patterns and cycles that were observed for the last couple thousand years prior. So they were usually very accurate to within a few days of when these things would happen. And they provide evidence for the types of events and circumstances that Babylonian astrologers would have considered meaningful. Although they're just details, they don't give us the interpretations. Now the record for 7 BC exists in 4 copies. We have 4 copies of the Babylonian records for 7 BC. And they describe the positions and the movements of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. And based on the information in those tablets, we know that they knew that Jupiter and Saturn would conjoin at least once and that there was a strong possibility of a triple conjunction occurring. So finding 4 copies of this astronomical almanac seems it's unusual, and it might suggest that the events of that particular year were considered significant. You see, these almanacs were trade secrets. They were very useful for the powers that be to help them make prognostications and to gain advantages over their opponents. They were very valuable, and they were not widely distributed. So the fact that we have 4 copies of this particular year might mean that this was a very significant year, that we would have so many copies. Here's an image. This is the almanac, one of those 4 copies for 7 BC. This is an image that I think now is held in the British Museum, right? So now let's take a look at these conjunctions in 7 BC. We'll go back to the star program here. All right, so I'm not going to go back to 7 BC or -7. I have to go to -6. That's 7 BC according to astronomers. And I'm going to go to May 14th. We'll go to about 3 a.m. Okay, so now you can see Jupiter and Saturn right there. Highlight Saturn again. Okay, you can see they're approaching each other in the sky. And as I progress through the days of the year, just take a look and see how Saturn comes and begins to catch up with Jupiter. You can go through. So Saturn has overtaken Jupiter, and you can watch as Saturn's movement begins to slow and Jupiter begins to take the lead. So go forward through the days, just like that. Now Jupiter takes the lead. All right, now I've got to move to a different time of the day so that we can see. So what I'm showing you is the same day, the same time of day over on numerous days. So if you set up a camera on a tripod and took a picture at 3 a.m. every day, what the sky would look like. So that's why they seem to be moving like that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to a different time of the day to bring them back into the middle of focus so we can watch that dance continue. I'll move a little later. Okay. So now we'll continue to move forward through the days. So we can see, we should be able to see Saturn come and overtake Jupiter once more. And then Saturn and Jupiter, and then Mars comes. You can see Mars coming up from the bottom there, joins the party, and all three just kind of become subsumed by the sun's rays. Right? So that was the triple conjunction. Everybody catch that? We'll go over it a little bit more. So I'm going to take a look at it one more time. I'm going to go all the way back and show you the heliacal rise. Remember the heliacal rise? So we're going to go back to April. Go to April 1st, and we'll look at it about 5 in the morning. We can watch the sunrise because it's really close to the sun. So as now we're gonna just watch the sunrise on this day of April 1st, and you could see there was just. I'll back up again. You can see Jupiter just emerge out there, but it's too close to the sun to see it for very long, right? So if I move, maybe I'll move to a little later. We'll go to the 15th and we'll go to a different time of the day. All right, so we'll go and watch. We'll see Saturn and Jupiter coming up just like that. We'll do that again. You can see as the sun begins to rise, they emerge as twin morning stars right there. So if you were watching early in the morning, you could see them. And so they're beginning to move farther away from the sun, and you'll see that that's their heliacal rise at this time. Now, let's talk about the timing of these conjunctions. When did these happen? We saw that the timing for the Maccabees was significant. What about these ones? When did they happen? Now, measuring that, there's a couple of ways you can measure that, because a conjunction occurs when the two planets line up on an axis, but there's more than one way to measure the sky, which means that there is potentially more than one way to measure when a conjunction happens. So we'll go back to here. You can see this grid that's up here. So that's sort of a set of coordinates that you can use to measure it. Well, there is more than one set of coordinates. So here, if you take the Earth, one major axis that you could use to set up a grid of the sky is based on what's called the ecliptic. Now, the ecliptic is that path that the sun makes through the sky. So if you were to imagine these books in this room as like the field of background stars. So the sun is right here, and the Earth is moving around the sun. And as the Earth moves around the sun has a different backdrop behind it, right? That you can imagine how the backdrop would change as the Earth is changing its angle in relation to the sun, right? So to us, perceiving the Earth as stationary, it looks like the sun is moving across the backdrop, right? And that path that cuts through is called the ecliptic, and the planets all kind of cut through a very, very similar path. So if you were to build then a grid based on that line that goes across the sky, that would be the ecliptic grid. Here's the problem, though. As you can see by this globe, it's not a defect, but the Earth is tilted by 23.4 degrees in relation to the ecliptic. So as the days go by, as you spin around, the ecliptic grid kind of wiggles. It wiggles back and forth, and as the Earth goes around the sun and it retains that same sort of angle, the ecliptic grid is wiggling, right? So it's a wobbling grid in the sky. So there's another type of grid that you can use to measure the sky, and it's called the equatorial grid. So the equator, as I'm sure you know, is that line that runs through the center, dividing the northern and southern hemispheres. It's perpendicular to the polar axis, right? And so if you were to imagine this equator just shooting off into the sky, and slicing the sky in half, that would be another axis that you could use. And the nice thing about that is it's lined up with the angle of the Earth. So as the Earth spins over the day, that equator, the celestial equator, stays in the same spot. And as the Earth moves around in the seasons, still the celestial equator stays in the same spot. So it's not wiggling around. That's the nice thing about the celestial equator. And so a grid built on that celestial equator is called the equatorial grid. That's the one I have showing right here. Okay, so just like if you had maybe a couple of racers making rounds around a racetrack, if you had a different finish line, you're going to have a different, if it's at a different angle, you're going to have a different definition of who wins, right? So that's why it's important to decide on which grid we're going to use, right? So most people measure the conjunctions according to the ecliptic, which makes a lot of sense, because that's the path that the planets are making through the stars. So if you were to look up the dates of when these conjunctions occur, you're going to get dates based on that calculation. Remember, they're not touching each other, they're moving past each other though. So there's not a moment when the two planets are not going to hit the same spot. So when I began to analyze these patterns, the stars and everything like that, I had a different grid up. I had this equatorial grid. And so when I was looking at when the conjunctions occurred, when the planets appeared to line up, I was getting different dates from everybody else. And I couldn't figure out why at first until I figured out that grid issue. But it appears to make sense. I mean, as you look at this through the, if we look at this according to the equatorial grid, it's very natural. It really it appears to make sense. It flows very well with our naked eye, and it's a natural way for the naked eye to measure. So here's an interesting thing then. With the equatorial grid as our frame of reference, we watch Saturn catch up with Jupiter. We watch Jupiter catch up with Saturn. I'm going backwards in time now. We'll go back through it again. So back to the heliacal rise is about back here. So then Jupiter, so Saturn comes and catches up with Jupiter. So let's find out when that happens according to the equatorial grid. It's coming through here. We're in May. We're in June. You know, right around here, they kind of line up with each other. That's June 3rd. This is what the sky looked like if you were to go outside from Jerusalem and look at the sky on June 3rd in the year of 7 BC. Okay? Now, when was that? If we were to measure that on the Hebrew calendar, the first conjunction occurred in June 7 BC. That happened on the 6th day of the month of Sivan in the Hebrew calendar, in the year 3754. Now, the 6th of Sivan is a very significant event, a very significant day in the Jewish calendar. It is the holiday of Shavuot. This is what the sky looked like on Shavuot in 7 BC. This is also known as Pentecost. It's the Feast of Weeks, right? It's the beginning of the wheat harvest. This holiday is mentioned in Leviticus 23. According to Jewish tradition, it's the anniversary of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And here I even have a picture of the actual 10 Commandments. This is a very important day, and that's the day when Jupiter and Saturn were aligned, just like this. So let's continue and look and see at the second conjunction, and that one happens to occur in September of 7 BC. And you kind of probably already know where I'm going with this, don't you? So here's August, and as we continue forward, and we're watching for Jupiter to catch up with Saturn, right? And we're now in September. All right, so we're looking at it. It's going forward. Jupiter's catching up with Saturn. You know, right here is September 24th of 7 BC. That day happens to be the first of Tishrei. That's on the Hebrew calendar. First of Tishrei is also known as Rosh Hashanah. That's some Christians refer to it as the Feast of Trumpets. It's the Jewish New Year. It's the new year in the Jewish calendar. And this is what the sky looked like on Rosh Hashanah in 7 BC. Now, an interesting thing about the Jewish New Year, okay, it's mentioned in Leviticus 23, of course, as the day of trumpet blasts. It's associated in Jewish tradition with coronation of kings. It's associated with freedom. It's associated with redemption. So it's hard to even imagine really a more significant date for a conjunction like this to occur, announcing the birth of Messiah, than on Rosh Hashanah. Now it's also noteworthy that this is a significant Babylonian holiday. Not just a Jewish holiday, it's a Babylonian holiday. Now, the Babylonians had 2 New Years. They had their main New Year in the spring, and they had a half New Year right here on the first of what they called Tashritu. They followed a very similar lunar calendar to what the Jewish people observed. So as the Magi were in Babylon looking out at the sky, they may have been celebrating their holiday of a half New Year as the sky looked just like this, right? So a really kind of an amazing coincidence that this is occurring. And there's our mascot for the celebration of Rosh Hashanah, blowing of the shofar. That's happens on this day, right? Okay, so let's take a look at the third conjunction and when this occurred. In the Julian calendar, it occurred in December of 7 BC. So we're going to move to, remember I have to move to a different time of the day. So I'm going to go now to December 1st. And we'll look at about we're going to look at about 5:30 p.m. All right. So we can see Jupiter and Saturn are pretty close to each other right now, but they're going to get even closer and line up as we move through. So first day of September or of December, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So this is the 16th of December. Saturn, you can see, has begun to pass Jupiter. And this happens to be right here. This is the day of the 25th of the Hebrew month of Kislev. 25th of Kislev is an important day on the Jewish calendar. It's also known as the first day of Hanukkah. So Hanukkah, as I mentioned to you, is the festival of the dedication of the temple. It's the day we were talking about the Maccabean revolt. It's the anniversary of that. So this conjunction is occurring. This is what it looked like, the sky looked like on the first day of Hanukkah. And you can see it's happening right in the southern sky, right, lined up with the southern sky. We're halfway in between, you could say, west and east. Okay, so let's back up a little bit to a little earlier and watch the sunset. So what's different, this is a little different from the other conjunctions. The other conjunctions, the sun would go down, it would become dark, and then the other conjunctions would rise in the east, and you'd see them coming up from the horizon. This one's not like that. The sun would go down, and the conjunction would already be in the sky by the time this happened. So let's watch as the sun goes down. I'll move forward and watch the sunset. All right, and you can see then Jupiter and Saturn emerge just like that at that time. Okay, so just imagine yourself being in, say, Bethlehem at this time. You're walking to Bethlehem from Jerusalem. You're heading south, and the sun is going down, and it's the 25th of Kislev. So what are you going to see in the homes of the Jewish people living in Bethlehem? In the windows, you're going to see people beginning to light their lamps, right? Because it's Hanukkah. Now, they didn't quite have menorahs like we have them now. But they did have lamps that they would use. And so as the sun is going down, that's the perfect time for you to be lighting your Hanukkah lamps. And then we need to see these stars, or these planets, very near each other in the sky. So it's an amazing, amazing thing. You're traveling south in the direction of Jerusalem. So here we are. Hanukkah is the feast of festival of the dedication of the temple. The event appears in the southern sky, and it doesn't occur. You won't find it in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament, but you will find this holiday mentioned in the New Testament in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 22, because it describes events that occurred after the Old Testament was written. Remember, it was in that 2nd century BC. So anyway, those are the three conjunctions, and I believe that based on numerous factors, that these were the astronomical events that led the Magi to Yeshua. Now, this is an image of a a reconstruction. And this is not an actual artifact. But if there was such thing as a Hanukkah menorah that existed in the first century, it would have been something like this, where the oil wicks would be all kind of deriving from that one source like that. It's possible it could have had a menorah like that. All right, so let me just recap for you. An astrological sign makes sense because in light of what we know about Magi, what we know about ancient Jewish lore, an astrological answer makes a lot of sense. The cycle of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, remember, is foundational to Persian astrology. So it's an important factor for us to be looking at. Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions coincided with major events in Jewish history. That's a very interesting coincidence, if you ask me. Including the Maccabean revolt and the Bar Kokhba revolt. Previous triple conjunctions seem to coincide with the births of the kings of the Jews. Seems to be another interesting coincidence. Not only that, but the conjunctions occurred on significant days on the Jewish calendar, as we saw them happening on Shavuot, and then on Rosh Hashanah, and then on Hanukkah, which to me, it seems like more than just coincidence. So, in conclusion, here's what I think happened. I'm going to reconstruct for you our history based on my wild speculation. In 7 BC, Parthian astrologers in Babylon, under the Parthian Empire, were anticipating the next conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. They knew it was going to happen. They were just waiting to find out what it means and what it would tell them about the reign of kings. So they observed the conjunction in June of that year, which happened to be around the time of the Jewish holiday of Shavuot. The conjunction occurred at the culmination of their 800-year astrological cycle, so it had a lot of significance to them. In the constellation of Pisces, the culmination of the zodiacal cycle. And as the time passed, they saw this was going to be a rare triple conjunction. There's no such thing as a double conjunction. And the second conjunction was going to happen at the Jewish New Year, which would happen also to be a festival that they were celebrating. The astrologers perceived from this event that a king was going to be born from the Jewish people, to the Jewish people. And we got a little sense about why they may have believed that, but there's a lot to the science of astrology that I don't know, and I couldn't imagine how they figured it out. Now, why did the Magi then set out to Israel? They were on a political mission, not a religious mission. The Magi, being Parthians, felt it necessary to secure positive diplomatic relations with the new king of the Jews, just like Herod had felt it was necessary to achieve positive diplomatic relations with the new king of the Magi 30 years prior. The Parthians wanted the Jews to be on their side. So they traveled to Jerusalem. Why did they travel to Jerusalem? Well, because that's the capital of the Jewish people. They were on a political mission. It's the capital of Judea. That's where the king's palace was, and that's where they expected the infant to be born. So when they arrived in Jerusalem, they were directed to Bethlehem in accordance with the biblical prophecy, and it was Herod who was the first person to consider the idea that this might be the Messiah they're talking about. So he directed them to Bethlehem according to the advice of his scholars. So as they approached Bethlehem on the first night of Hanukkah, they recognized that the third conjunction had occurred. The phenomenon appeared at sunset. They could see it in the southern sky in the direction they're traveling, and astrological signs directed them to the home where the child was. I don't know what those astrological signs exactly were, because I'm not an astrologer, but somehow they figured out where the child was. Now, with all of that we've looked at, with all that exciting adventure that you've been on with me, there's a few points that we should take away from this. Even if it turns out that I was completely wrong, there's a few things that we need to know that we learned from this presentation. The Jewish author of the Gospel of Matthew and his Jewish audience would have considered this story significant because it replayed the ancient stories that they had heard about Abraham and about Moses. And this teaches us the macaroni principle. To understand the Bible, we have to seek the original historical and cultural and linguistic and religious context. And we have to remember that the entire Bible is a Jewish book. There's so many beautiful things that you can learn when we look at the New Testament in light of Judaism. This story did not in any way represent a break from Jewish culture or a break from Jewish religion, but it was just another chapter in the unfolding story of the Jewish people.